Welcome back to The Ordinary Effect. I'm your host, Guido Prino. Thank you for joining me. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Stay with us. This week, why the U.S.-Venezuela conflict feels so personal to people. Now, there's a moment that happens when a big international story breaks, and it almost always happens before we realize it. You might be scrolling, listening to the radio while making coffee, or half watching the news while doing something else entirely. And then you hear it. A headline about military action, about the United States, about Venezuela. And even if you don't follow geopolitics closely, even if you couldn't explain the full history or outline the political players or tell someone exactly how it escalated, you feel something shift. That's the part we rarely talk about. Because before we analyze, before we debate, before we decide who's right or wrong, there's a very human, very quiet reaction that happens first. A tightening, a pause. A thought that sounds something like, wait, what's really going on here? Some people feel concern, some feel anger, some feel reassurance, some feel suspicion, some feel tired. Like they've seen this story before, only with different names and different places. And what's interesting isn't just the event itself. It's how quickly we start telling ourselves what it means. Almost immediately, explanations appear. One explanation says this is about security, about crime, instability, regional safety, responsibility. Another explanation says this is about power, about influence, resources, leverage, and yes, oil. And here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people uneasy. Both explanations can exist at the same time. But what we rarely pause to examine is why we personally gravitate towards one explanation more than the other. Because this story isn't just about Venezuela, and it's not just about the United States. It's about how we understand power and whether we trust it. There's a reason the phrase, "it's about oil," shows up so quickly in conversations like this. Venezuela has some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. That's not speculation, that's fact. And history has taught people repeatedly that resources and power tend to travel together. So for many people, the conclusion doesn't feel cynical, it feels learned. They've seen similar patterns before. They've watched explanations change after the fact. They've watched moral language used alongside economic interests. So when they say it's about oil, what they're really saying is, I don't trust powerful countries to act without self-interest. On the other side, there are people who hear that explanation and feel frustrated. To them, "it's about oil" sounds like a shortcut, like it ignores real problems, crime, corruption, instability, threats that don't respect borders. It sounds dismissive of the idea that government might act for reasons that aren't purely economic. And very quickly, people aren't actually arguing about what happened. They're arguing about how the world works. That's why these conversations get heated so fast. Because when someone challenges your explanation of a global event, it can feel like they're challenging your intelligence, your values, or your moral compass, even if that wasn't their intention. We think we're debating facts, but often we're defending identity. And sitting just beneath that identity debate is another question people keep circling, sometimes without even realizing it. Was what the United States did actually legal? Not whether it was justified, not whether it was effective, not whether it was necessary. Just, was it allowed? This is where things start to feel slippery for a lot of people because international law doesn't behave the way we expect law to behave. Most of us grew up with a very clear idea of how law works. There are rules, there are boundaries, there are consequences. Something is legal or illegal, and there's usually a process to determine which one it is. International law may not be like that. There's no global police force. There's no international emergency number. There's no courtroom where a judge immediately weighs evidence and issues a binding verdict. Instead, international law is more like a shared rule book, one that countries agree to follow, interpret, and sometimes bend. At its most basic level, the rule is simple enough. Countries are not supposed to use military force inside another country unless one of a few conditions applies. Either they're acting in self-defense, or they have permission from that country, or they have authorization from international bodies like the United Nations. That's the version most people never hear explained plainly. So when people ask, was this legal? What they're really asking is, which of those justifications is being claimed, and do you believe it fits? Supporters of the U.S. action argue that it falls under security or self-defense, that it targets criminal networks, instability, or threats that extend beyond Venezuela's borders. Critics argue that this stretches the idea of self-defense too far, that it bypasses international norms, undermines sovereignty, and creates a dangerous precedent where powerful countries decide for themselves when rules apply. And here's the part that unsettles people the most. There isn't a referee who steps in and settles this cleanly. In international conflicts, legality is often argued in hindsight through diplomacy, pressure, consequences, and history, not through an immediate ruling everyone agrees on. That uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable because it clashes with how we think law should work. It makes people feel like the rules are flexible for some and rigid for others. And when that perception takes hold, trust starts to erode. That doesn't automatically mean the action was illegal, but it explains the unease. It explains why people who strongly oppose the Venezuelan government can still feel conflicted, why people who value international order worry about precedent, why others shrug and say, this is just how the world works. All of those reactions come from the same place, a sense that power and law don't always move together. And when legality feels unclear, people fill the gap with stories. Oil, control, history, imperialism, security. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and stories give that discomfort somewhere to land. Another thing we almost never talk about is how distance changes how we judge these events. When conflict happens far away, it becomes abstract, a headline, a talking point, a position. But for the people living there, it isn't abstract at all. It's disruption, it's fear, it's uncertainty about tomorrow. And yet, in our conversations, those human consequences often fade into the background while we argue about motives. That doesn't mean motives don't matter. They do. But when we focus only on intent, oil or security, greed or responsibility, we sometimes forget that harm can exist regardless of which explanation you believe. And that's uncomfortable to acknowledge because it forces us out of clean narratives. It forces us to accept that even actions we believe are justified can still cause suffering. And even actions we believe are exploitative can still be complicated. As listeners, as citizens, as people trying to make sense of a world that feels increasingly unstable, maybe the more honest question isn't which side is right, but why does the story land the way it does for me? Why does It's About Oil feel obvious or feel insulting? Why do I trust certain explanations and dismiss others immediately? Why do I feel pressure to be certain? Those questions don't weaken your position. They deepen your understanding of yourself. And that's something we rarely encourage in public conversation. We tell people to pick a side. We don't tell them to examine their instincts. And maybe that's the ordinary effect hiding in all of this. Not the geopolitics, not the legality, not the oil, but the way distant events quietly reveal our assumptions about power, fairness, and trust. As this situation continues, and it will, opinions will harden. Narratives will sharpen. People will dig deeper. But maybe there's value in resisting that reflex, just a little, in allowing room for complexity, in admitting discomfort without immediately turning it into certainty, in remembering that most people reacting to this story are doing so from lived experience, not malice. You don't have to abandon your beliefs to do that. You just have to slow down long enough to notice why you hold them. And that, quietly, is something we all notice, but rarely talk about. This is The Ordinary Effect. Thank you for listening. I hope you subscribe. Hope you come back next week. Take care and be good to each other.